G'day punters. I've been a little bit light with the YouTube videos over the winter period. A couple of reasons. Most importantly, I've just been working really hard at keeping myself and my punters in play over the winter period. We've certainly held our own. We've competed hard, given ourselves lots of really good opportunities. The rub of the green's been a little bit unkind, but you know, generally speaking, we've been in the game and we're okay. And you know, that sort of thing, I don't mind, because I've found over the years that the more good opportunities you give yourself, the harder you work and you put yourself in those positions, eventually the rub of the green finds you. So we'll just keep at it, and I'm sure there's some good results around the corner. I thought it was a good chance to do a bit of a video because you know, I've been disappointed over years at the coverage of racing and the lack of exposure that the actual gambling side and the betting side of the industry gets. I suppose I've just come to accept that the current media are not going to change, that's the way they do things, and the constant focus is going to be on horses, trainers and jockeys, and they're going to keep getting the same result, which is, you know, an industry that has so much to offer and is almost operating at its minimal level, and it's just going to continue to hang in there, but it could be so much better. And the reason I'm sort of thinking in those lines right at this time is, you know, that in the past week there would have been, the past 2 weeks I suppose it's been, there would have been tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of eyes of young people that have an interest in gambling, an interest in mathematics, an interest in the sort of challenges that racing presents, and their eyes would have been on the World Series of Poker main event tournament in Las Vegas, where they were playing for a first prize of $8.8 million. All of that prize money provided by the competitors. You know, there was 8,000 starters, and they paid 10,000 each to participate. So you know, why has poker got that audience? Why has poker got that many people that are willing to come from all parts of the world and pay that entry to participate in that kind of event? Because they have sold to that audience, that young, interested, mathematically inclined, gambling inclined audience, the challenges of assessing the value of your position compared to your opponents, to mathematically what's the right size bet, what are the more intricate challenges of playing your opponent, and how have they done that poker? Well, they got buy-in from their stars, from their leading players, to give insight to how they were going about those challenges in poker. Now, on the over the weekend, I watched a little bit of the final table, and there they had Phil Hellmuth commentating, who's, you know, he would be their leading gambler. Like, he'd be equivalent to, you know, Dr. Nick or the Bartholomews or Jelko or whoever you want to pick from a racing analogy comparison. And Phil was saying things like he's happy to go on ESPN and commentate because he wants the viewers to understand how exciting poker can be, how challenging it can be, what a beautiful game it is. He was talking all these positive things about poker and how he was willing to share his knowledge with those tens of millions of young eyes that were watching. And I just think how different racing is to it. Now, when we're talking about poker, I know there's differences, but in poker, the cards are like the horses, you know. Winks is a pair of aces, you know what I mean? Like, but you can only make so much money out of a pair of aces. You know, you don't win that tournament by betting on the best hand. You win that tournament by getting maximum value out of your hand in comparison to the value of your opponents, and, you know, doing that repeatedly. So anyway, I mean, I just think it's a really interesting comparison. I just wish that the administrators of racing would have a look at what poker's done, try and engage with their large punters, try and get them to be willing to expose more of their operations. And that's because those young, mathematically minded gambling types out there, that's what they would aspire to be. they would aspire to be Kingsley Bartholomew or Sean Bartholomew or Dr. Nick or his son or Jelko or whoever, but they won't aspire to be a jockey, and very few of them will aspire to be a trainer. So it's an opportunity that still exists for racing that's not being taken advantage of. So I just wanted to talk through some of the betting that happened at Caulfield on Saturday. Now, if you watch mainstream media, you won't hear any of this type of conversation because all they'll talk about are the horses, trainers and jockeys. They won't talk about the betting. So let's just cover 3 races there on Saturday that have particular interest to punters. And I think if this story was told in more detail and they got down into it, and particularly if the participants were willing to share some of their insights, I think young punters would lap it up. But maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my opinion. So let's start with the Mount Kilcoy Masculino race. So there's a 3-year-old race over 2,000 metres, a big field of 3-year-olds, and there are 2 main chances. The really interesting part about this race is as soon as the 9 o'clock minimum bet limit time ticked over, 2 of the big teams went to war. One of them in the Masculino camp and one of them in the Mount Kilcoy camp. So Mount Kilcoy was first to shorten, in from about $3 to around the $2.50 mark. And that was straight after 9 o'clock, and then probably about an hour later the support started to come for Masculino. So I'm going to guess a little bit. The Mount Kilcoy support was from one of the Bartholomews, I'm not sure which, but it could have been both. And the Masculino support seemed to come from the Dr. Nick camp. So I mean, in the end, who won doesn't really matter, but it was just really interesting to watch the betting develop there. So once the first wave of support come for Masculino, they were at a point where they were taking up too much percentage in the race, and you know that had to shake out a little bit once the tote comparisons kicked in the final sort of 20 minutes of betting, and from that point the Betfair comparison as well. So it was a bit of a tug of war through the first 10. If I talk about that final 20 minutes of betting, for the first 10 minutes of that, it was a bit of a tug of war, and then the Masculino supporters started to get the upper hand, and Mount Kilcoy started to drift. And, you know, late in betting, Masculino was the stronger, and Mount Kilcoy got out towards that, outside the $3.50 mark. Now, you know, why am I interested in this, in this side of it? Because, you know, I'm just a fringe player. Here's a race where I really think that there's a very high percentage chance that one of those 2 horses is going to win the race. I'd like to have a winning result on both horses. So then it's just a matter of me picking which time I back them. So, you know, I started to build a position from Friday afternoon on Masculino with the expectation that at some point in the betting I could get onto Mount Kilcoy to have a smaller result but still a winning result. So, I mean, in the end that worked out. I backed Mount Kilcoy in the last 30 seconds of betting. It may not have, or I might have had to choose to take a price well below where I'd marked it, but in the end it worked out okay. And while I was cheering for Masculino, I was happy for either horse to win. But the battle between the 2 big teams there was fascinating. So that's one example. Then we can move on to the Voodoo Lad Jukebox race. Not so much the big teams necessarily there, a little bit of stable-inspired support involved. But so from early on in the week, there seemed to be a tip around for Jukebox, probably emanating out of the stable or connections, and sort of gathered a bit of momentum in the media. There was a lot of media types tipping that horse. So surprisingly to me, because a lot of the hard-nosed, tough punting types that I talked to in the lead-up all had that horse Jukebox sort of 380 or longer. He was the favourite race morning, sort of around the $283 mark, and Voodoo Lad was still upwards of $4 was still obtainable at 9 AM. So it was a good situation for me and my punters, because we'd started to build a position on Voodoo Lad from Friday afternoon and again Saturday morning, in the expectation that there was going to be some late stable inspired support for Voodoo Lad. Now in the end that came, and it came very strongly, much stronger than I anticipated. If only you'd had that information earlier, I would have had a bet double the size I did on Voodoo Lad, but I still had a really strong bet. Jukebox lead eased dramatically late, and again it was a race where the betting was very interesting and enlightening. And in the run, I sort of given the late support for Voodoo Lad. It just seemed to me that the race was over the minute they came out of the stalls. That Voodoo Lad just had them covered with that type of support behind him. And then finally, the other race that was very interesting from a betting point of view was the last race of the card. Now, this one was very interesting because from the first time I looked at this race and assessed it, I could see that mathematically a lot of the models were going to find Barcelona and market very short. And to be honest, I had trouble getting away from that horse myself. I had to really talk myself into it. I went out and walked the track and thought, geez, this is a high pressure race in terms of there are more than half the field here are natural on pace runners, and the pressure is going to keep coming. So it's not that they went that quickly, it's just that the pressure kept being forced into the race because they haven't run particularly good figures in that race. And in my view, it was going to suit Widgie Turf, and his late strength was going to be the key factor in the race. So taking that into account and sort of pushing the figures as far as I could, I managed to get Widgie Turf as favourite in my market, not a lot ahead of Barcelona. I was very wary of Call Me Handsome. I thought he might need one more run, but he's a talented horse, and I really wanted him on my side. Obviously, the Answer My Friend having his first run for Darren Weir was an intriguing runner, and his stable and inspired support there was going to be an interesting aspect of that race. And then the other one in the mix was Malaise. Now, I personally thought if everything goes right for Malaise here, I felt like he was still going to come up about a length short. Now, as it turns out, he got a centimetre perfect ride from Craig Williams, and that won him the race. So this race didn't turn out well for me particularly. The betting was very interesting. I thought that mathematical support for Barcelona would come to an end at some point, and late in betting there could be some strong layers around, but that didn't really happen. He kept getting out towards the $3 mark, and every time he did, another wave of support had come. So I think that says that a lot of the big teams, all of them, had marked him at $3 and shorter. There wasn't one of them taking a counterpoint position there to get his price out over that $3 mark. And that sort of meant that the others all sort of waxed and waned a bit, and you know, there was support for them at different times in the market, then there were layers for them, and in the end, you'd have to say that probably the strongest supporter outside of Barcelona was probably Call Me Handsome, I would say. And he didn't have a lot of luck. He probably should have won the race. But it was a very competitive race. Now, me personally, in that race, I took an early position with Widgie Turf, and I was happy to keep going later. I put a lot of my chips in play in that race. The two strongest positions I took were Widgie Turf and Call Me Handsome. I had a neutral position on Barcelona and sort of didn't want to injure myself too much, but at the price he he did go around a loser for me, and I was just sort of wary of the Answer My Friend and sort of, you know, let him go around a small loser. Malaise was a bad result for me, but you know, even with the benefit of hindsight, I'm really happy with the positions I took in that race. I put about 2% of my bank in play on that race. As I said, Widgie Turf was by far my strongest position, with Call Me Handsome a strong winner as well. And you know, I think if I do that enough times repetitively over the course of the year, that's a winning proposition, and I'm happy to with the way I read that race and the way I bet in that race. And in the end, going back to some of the poker analogies, that's what makes the players that win those tournaments, and what makes the punters that are so fascinating, like the big teams, is that they're willing. It's very easy after the race, and there's a lot of good racing analysts out there that talk in really good terms after the race, but it's before the race when you're making those betting decisions and how much of your bank are you prepared to put in play in these outcomes. And you know, I was happy with my analysis of that race, and I was certainly happy with the amount of chips I put in play. Didn't turn out for me on that occasion, but I was you know, happy to be faced with that same situation again and put the same amount of chips in play, and feel that's a profitable position to take over the long term. All right, punters, we're nearly up to the 15-minute mark. That'll do us for this. I won't say this week's, I'll say this month's edition of Punting Melbourne Style, and I'll be back in the not too distant future with another one. Cheers, punters.